Sprouted quinoa bread. That's what we're going to be making today. It's really delicious, nutritious, and a lot easier to make than you may believe. Hello friends, my name is Christopher, and this is Dinosaur Omelet. If you're here for the first time, hit the old subscribe or like button. We appreciate you coming by, and the content we try to do here is practical and useful and educational and informative stuff. Stop on by, we do regular live teachings as well. So my wife Angela and I have a small homestead in southern Lancaster County where we raise quail and chickens, all kinds of fun little animals. And I'm the main chef, I'm the main cook here, so I make all of our food, and I make most of our food from scratch. I've been making our own bread for many years now. And this is actually a very tasty, fun, and easy to make bread. It does take a while. We're going to be sprouting grains, and that'll take a few days. I suspect 2 or 3 days is about the time it takes to sprout our quinoa. But that time actually goes by pretty quickly. So what are the ingredients in this bread? I don't want to waste too much time showing you how I pour ingredients in a bowl. I think you guys can gather that. There are a couple things to know about mixing bread ingredients. Your yeast is extremely important. With the yeast, you want to proof it. Proofing yeast is simply making sure that it's going to work, that it's alive. The yeast is a living little critter, or a bunch of little critters, and you want to make sure they're going to be functioning to produce the carbon dioxide that actually instigates that rising, so the bread does rise. Very proof yeast is we'll pour it into our vessel. I'll be using a big bowl. Add a little bit of sugar, just about a tablespoon of sugar. The sugar is what the yeast eat and lets them know that, hey, dinner's here, wake up dudes. And we're gonna add water, lukewarm water, not hot water. Hot water will, of course, cook the little dudes, and we don't like that. We want them to be doing their work. So let's proof our yeast. We're going to mix the yeast, mix the sugar with a beater just gently for a few seconds, maybe a minute, so that it gets a little frothy, and we're gonna let that sit for 5 or 10 minutes. And we're gonna notice that the yeast is alive, it's gonna be bubbly, and you're gonna notice froth starting to form. That means it's active. If it's not active, it's just gonna be sitting there like a mud swamp. So if you don't have living yeast, make sure you get some and try again. All right, why am I using sprouted quinoa grains? Well, these grains are very nutritious. They're fiber dense. They're full of protein, amino acids, and they're very good for you. They're very tasty, and they're very easy to sprout. So why do we sprout them? So if you guys do not understand what sprouting is, apart from the seeds starting to show a little root, the sprouting process, particularly in the space of health or nutrition or your diet, when you're sprouting a grain, a few things are happening. So after you soaked your grain and it's beginning to sprout, what's going on is a whole bunch of really cool metabolic processes. The seed's coming to life. It's starting to come to life, and it's starting to break down the starches in the seed. It's starting to produce new enzymes and new vitamins for the little plant that's emerging to have a happy, healthy life. So all these changes are happening in here, and it's good for your digestive system. Sprouted foods are actually, I guess technically partially digested or partially broken down. So they're much more bioavailable when you ingest them, human being ingests them. They're already partially broken down, and you have more nutrients present. So those nutrients and those vitamins and those enzymes that are being produced by the sprouting process are now also more bioavailable, meaning that you can absorb them cellularly and they can get into your body. So how do we sprout the dry greens and make them come to life? These are wet. These are my already sprouted grains, and these are the dry quinoa. So how do we sprout these? Sprouting greens is thankfully very, very simple. You're just getting them wet. Now with these, I'm going to pour water over them, but I'm going to make sure to mix them up so that the water saturates everything. And what I'm going to show you here, I'm going to show you guys what I did to make a sprouting container that I use for a lot of things that I do sprout, like lentils, the other beans, the quinoa, chias. This is an old mayonnaise jar, a plastic container. So my sprouting jar is just an old mayonnaise jar where I cut a hole in the lid and I hot glue a circle of screen material in there. So when I go to rinse what's sprouting, it's not falling out, but I can squeeze the water out. So the water's coming out, and then I can rinse them again. Ooh, as a bonus, down in the description, I have not only the ingredients, but a nutrition profile, a rough nutrition profile written down about the calories and nutrition content of a slice of this delicious bread. So once you filled your quinoa with water, give it a mix. Mix it up. Make sure you're getting it nice and saturated. So as you can see, after that first mixing, we stirred it up. You can see the debris. It's a little dirty. You want to drain this out and then refill it and let it sit for about 6 hours. So you're going to cover these again, cover the quinoa again and let it sit for 6 hours or so, 6 to 12 hours. And what's going to happen, the water is going to get absorbed into the seed and then you're going to drain it. This water is going to be saturating into these seeds for the 6 to 12 hours. Drain it again and then just let it sit out for, sit out overnight. But you're going to routinely rinse these. That's right. Yeah, you have to rinse these. What's happening too, when you are sprouting these grains, it's not just grain in here. Any kind of grain is going to have a similar issue. And the issue is that there are bacteria present. There's usually lactobacillus bacteria. So what is that going to do? It's going to start a fermentation. It's going to start to ferment and it's going to be a little sour smelling. So you're going to rinse it a couple times while it's sprouting. It's not going to hurt the sprouting. They're still going to sprout fine. But you want to rinse it a couple times to get that fermentation byproduct out of there, that lactic acid, and just rinse it clean and then let it sit again. And like I said, in about 2 to 3 days, you're going to start noticing those little squigglies when it sprouts. And so because this is a heavier bread, it's got a lot of fiber in it. I like to use, personally, I like to use a little more yeast. For this bread, I'll put like 4 little packets of active yeast. It's going to speed up that whole rising process. It's going to make it a little fluffier and mainly for the time. It'll rise over time, but I just add a little extra yeast to hasten the process. This is a very fiber-rich bread and the oats are going to suck up a lot of moisture, a lot of the water. So I like to add a little extra water as I'm mixing this. As you mix it, you're going to notice it's not clumping together as well as it did when it started. And that's because the rolled oats are like little tiny baby sponges and they're going to start taking up a lot of the water. So if you're mixing this bread and you have the rolled oats in it, you probably want to keep some water to the side and add it as it's mixing. I run this bread wet. I like to keep it a little moist, not gooey, of course, but just a little wetter because of the oats. One of my favorite ingredients to add to my darker breads is molasses. A little bit of molasses will give a bit more of a sweet flavor to it. And it's going to give it a rich, earthy flavor. It's very delicious. I love adding molasses into my wheat breads, my table breads, my breakfast breads. The next thing I need to do, of course, is I want to incorporate the quinoa. The quinoa, I'm never going to mix into the dry ingredients. It will just clump up. So I'm mixing it into the wet base and I will incorporate it and I'm going to whisk it through. Once the quinoa is thoroughly mixed in here, I'm going to start adding the dry ingredients, all the flour, oats, and chia seeds and flax seeds, all that good stuff. I'm going to start mixing it in and I'm going to get the consistency to about I guess a thick paste is a good way to describe it. Because what's happening once this is mixed, I'm going to transfer it to an electric mixer and I like letting the electric mixer do the work because it's pretty labor intensive. I'm kind of lazy. So I'm going to let the electric mixer do most of the work once I transfer it over to there. If you haven't mixed bread in your mixer before, this is a bread hook. The bread hook's exceptionally important for mixing bread because it will not get clogged. The paddle bits will definitely clog up very, very quickly and you're not going to be able to do much. So do use a bread hook. This is the fun part, incrementally adding your dry ingredients, adding a little bit of flour, a little bit at a time, so it gets thoroughly incorporated into your dough mix in the mixer. The mixer does a lot of the work, but it's not going to do all the work. You probably want to keep something handy so you can scrape the excess flour that's not getting incorporated into the dough from the sides, just so it gets in there. It does push it to the sides, so just be aware of that if you haven't used one of these before. Okay, I'm just about done mixing this. I'm going to take it out and knead it. Knead, K-N-E-A-D. Knead the bread so it's a nice spongy consistency. All right, people, let's prep our space. I'm going to sprinkle a little flour so it doesn't stick directly to the counter. And that's going to give a little flour as well to incorporate into this bread because it is a little tacky. It's a little wet. The electric kitchen mixer did most of the work getting the flour into this dough, but I'm going to add a little extra and more precisely while I'm mixing this and kneading it on the counter, I'm going to get it to the proper consistency. I want to have a nice, consistent, spongy loaf of bread dough. All right, people, now take a look. What's happening when you're kneading your bread, I may sprinkle in a little extra flour to get the proper consistency. This is not exact science. I've been doing this a long time, and you kind of learn as you practice that you want your bread to not just bleh, roll out like it's liquid, but you also don't want it breaking apart and stiff as a board. You want it to be spongy. You push it, it should bounce back a little. Because this is so dense with high fiber ingredients, it's a lot heavier and it's not going to sponge back so quickly, but I'm still going to get that consistency I want. And we'll let it sit while it rises and let the yeast do its work. Now, if you look, when I knead this bread, you may notice it's tearing in spots. That's okay. That's going to happen because of the oats and the other ingredients. They're going to incorporate into this loaf. I've made it a bunch of times, and it always comes out fine. You just want to have a decent consistency. I keep this bread a little wetter, like I said, to hold it together and to give it a little chewier texture once it cooks. So it's not springing back like a white bread, but it is springing back. So I'm going to call that done. I'm going to throw it in a bowl. But before we throw it in a bowl, sprinkle a little flour so it doesn't stick. It's in a bowl. We're going to let him sit for about 40 minutes, 35, 40 minutes. I'm going to let it rise till it's about double size, and then knead it again and let it rise again. The end. All right, cool. Now we're going to let the bread rise, but while it's rising, we're going to do some quick bread class. So once this bread is done rising, I'm going to punch it down and fold it and knead it a few more times and let it rise again, a second rise. Why are we doing this? Double rising. Why do we double rise bread or knead it and mash it down after it's risen the first time? Well, there's a couple reasons we're going to do that. When you're doing this, you're redistributing the yeast and the sugars present in that dough, and it's going to allow the yeast to ferment even more, producing more carbon dioxide and producing more of those fermentation byproducts. You're also going to be creating a little more elasticity in the bread as you redistribute throughout the kneading process. Ooh, and a big benefit that I like is that yeast fermentation produces that delicious bready flavor, that flavor that we like that is in the bread. One of them anyway is that yeast flavor, that fermentation flavor. So it allows a little longer fermentation as well to enhance the deliciousness of your bread. For the second rise of this bread, the second rise is going to be in loaves. So the first rise I'm punching down, and I'm now going to form loaves. The recipe I'm using has enough flour and enough ingredients to make 2 big loaves of bread. So I'm going to split them and make 2 loaves of bread, grease a bread pan, and throw them into the bread pan to rise the second time, which I'll give them again about 45 minutes or so. And then they're going to take a trip off to the oven at 350 for about 35 or 40 minutes. Because there's so much moisture in this particular loaf, I'm going to let it cook a little longer for that 35, 40 minute mark. And that should do it. After the first rise is done, I'm going to punch this loaf down. I'm going to knead it again just a few more times, get the yeast and sugars reincorporated, get the elasticity back, cut this thing in half, make 2 loaves, and then house each one into a bread pan and let them rise again for another 40 minutes or so. Okay, great. Second rise is done. Here's a little thing I suggest you guys do. I'm going to split the top of the bread, because when it cooks, when you put it in the oven, it's going to expand. As it expands, it's going to crack. It's not going to hold up on the top. The top of the crust is going to rip apart. It's going to look ugly. It's not going to cut well. And so I just like to put a simple split, and I like to add water. I wet the top because this is going to create a crustier crusty crust. So add a little water, and you'll have a nice crust once it is done cooking. Now it's time for our buddies to go in the oven. So I'm going to stick these loaves in the oven for about 40 minutes. Well, there you go, guys. This is a very fun bread to make and very tasty. That quinoa actually does ferment a little bit in that jar, so you have that really delicious sour flavor. It's not overpowering. It's just enough to give the bread a very distinct flavor, as well as the texture of that quinoa. I hope this was informative. You guys learn a little bit. Maybe it's a bread you'd like to try. Get to the kitchen and start trying. These breads are fun to make. They're easy to make. And they're so much better than getting a loaf of bread from the store. Even better than those special artisanal breads in the bakery. These homemade breads are really great. Again, appreciate you guys watching. Hit the like button. Please subscribe to this fabulous channel as we do, like I said, try to produce practical, applicable information, quality information. There's so much garbage on the internet, and now we're getting saturated with AI nonsense. So I'm a real human doing real bread. So go ahead, like, subscribe, come on back, stick around for some of our educational videos in our live section, or attend one of our live classes we do practically every week. Thanks for coming in, guys. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment, and I will certainly see you on the next one.